The reading is taken from Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. The Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them.
Thanks, Celia. Between the ages of 18 and 29, I lived in Canterbury in Kent. It's a beautiful city, it's a great place to live. It's actually quite a small city in terms of population, just over 50,000 or so. But in the summer months, that population is doubled or trebled by an incredible number of tourists who come to the city to look at the cathedral and the Canterbury Tales and St Augustine's Abbey, etc. And so in August, walking up the high street is such an incredible experience through the hustle and bustle of loads of different people of every tribe and tongue and colour and creed. It's vibrant and pulsating and alive. Well, in the passage that Celia just read to us, the disciples are inside a house. But right outside their front door would have been a scene that looked something like Canterbury in the summer. It was a festival atmosphere with thousands of people hustling and bustling. The reason they were there was because it was the Feast of Pentecost. The Jewish people had three main festivals each year: the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Passover, and the Feast of Pentecost, the latter of which was celebrating the giving of the Ten Commandments. And people would come from all over the known world to Jerusalem to pray and worship and party. So the street would have been heaving with people. It would have been a wonderful sight. We don't know if Jesus' friends had gone inside for a bit of peace and quiet, or if they'd taken the party inside with them. But we do know that something very special happened. And that was that God gave the gift of his Holy Spirit. You see, Jesus' friends had been hanging out with Jesus for a few years. They'd been travelling around with him, witnessing his miracles, hearing his teaching. They were there when he died. They saw him again after he had risen from the dead. And just 10 days before this, they'd watched as he'd ascended into heaven. But before he left, he had promised that he wouldn't be leaving them alone, that he would send them the gift of his Holy Spirit, so that even though he wasn't with them physically, they could still know him in their hearts. And indeed, that we, thousands of years later, can still know him in our hearts too. And so that was what happened on that day of Pentecost. God gave the gift of his Holy Spirit. Jesus' friends couldn't see the Holy Spirit arriving, but they could sense it because God sent two signs. One was something that they heard, and the second was something that they saw. What they heard was the sound of mighty wind. During lockdown, we've been hearing the sound of mighty wind in our house a lot. But to be fair, Tors has been eating a lot of curry. I don't think it was that kind of mighty wind, actually. It was more like when you stand in a tree tunnel, when you've got big trees around and arching overhead, and the sound of the wind whooshes down. I think it must have sounded something like that. It's a symbol of God's power and might and majesty. And then they saw what appeared to them to be like little flames or tongues of fire that alighted on each of their heads. And that was a symbol of God's light and life. And it was really important that it wasn't just one big fire, but little flames alighting on each of them. It's a symbol that each of us can know God's Holy Spirit in our own hearts. We don't need a rabbi or a vicar or a parent to stand between us and God. each of us can know the fire of God's Holy Spirit burning in our hearts. And that's what happened with Jesus' friends. And they were so excited by this that they rushed outside into the carnival, into the festival, and they began to tell people the good news of Jesus. And clearly, as they were doing it, they were having great fun, because some people thought that they were even drunk. They weren't. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. But there was something about the way that they were acting that was so fun and so appealing. Something about the things that they were saying about Jesus that made all these other people want to follow Jesus as well. And 3,000 people decided to follow Jesus on that day. That's why some people call Pentecost the birthday of the church, because so many people joined the community that day. It was like it launched. Thank you. So, today is the birthday of the church. I don't know if you know why we light candles on birthday cakes. Actually, there's a whole variety of reasons. In part, it's because of stuff to do with Greek mythology, in part to do with some Orthodox traditions in the Middle Ages. But I wonder if, for us, whether each time we see a birthday candle, it might remind us of God's Holy Spirit living in us, of his fire burning in our hearts. And you see, even though we might feel like just one small little candle, well, a small flame can light a big fire, just as it did that day on Pentecost. Each of Jesus' friends played their part, but together they were so amazing and so enthused about God that 3,000 people came to follow him. Maybe each of us in our small way, with our small flame, can be part of that big fire of God's Holy Spirit working in our community, our nation, and our world. That's the story of Pentecost.